Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
And welcome, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo, and I am your sensei and host, Gary Michuta. Great to be with you today. I love apologetics, and there's nothing better than, learning more about the faith, being able to share the faith, and learning how to defend the faith with clarity and charity. And that's what we're all about here on Hands-On Apologetics, is to kind of, gain as much wisdom as we can so that when we're out in the world, we'll be able to share Christ with others charitably and with fidelity. And that's why we're here. That's why I get up in the morning every day. And, why don't we start off the show with our shout-outs to those watching live stream on Facebook and YouTube. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the sheep emoji explosion, Michelle. Appreciate it. And I also want to welcome all you listening on the radio, because we're going to have as our guest today the guy who started it all as far as modern Catholic apologetics in America, and that is the Grand Poobah. I wouldn't even call him a master apologist. He's the Grand Poobah of apologists as far as I'm concerned. Karl Keating. Karl Keating's going to be joining us, and we're going to talk about apologetics the English way. There's such a incredible, explosion of awesome Catholic English apologists around the turn of the last century that, we still can learn so much from their works. And, people like Arnold Lund and Hilaire Belloc and, Frank Sheed. And so I know Karl Keating, that's one of his first loves, is he loves, English apologists during that era. And it's also one of my loves as well. So he's going to be coming on the other side of the first break. And we're going to talk about apologetics the English way. It should be a lot of fun. Karl always has these great insights and, background information that really brings the subject alive. So I'm looking forward to that. Also, we have our critical thinking skills, finding the fallacy. And today's fallacy, by the way, is the loaded language / label fallacy. And, I'm going to combine two. They're really kind of distinct. The loaded label is more of a fallacy. Loaded language is more of a propaganda technique. But you know what? You guys are worth it. We're going to roll them up into one and have that as our discussion piece. And also, we're going to meet an early church father today. Early church father, I don't think is very well known. Maybe he is. I don't know. It's Saint Germain I of Constantinople. So interesting early church father indeed. And for those who are listening, and maybe you have a question for Karl Keating, maybe there is an English author that we're not going to touch on that you want us to touch on, give us a call at 888-526-2151. That's 888-526-2151. Or you can always email your questions to the Dojo mailbox. And, thank you so much for those who have emailed. I know it's been a while since I've addressed this on the air. The Dojo mailbox is exploding with emails. We've had such a run of great guests. I just haven't had the chance to work it in. I promise sometime in the future we'll get to the mailbox and we'll answer your letters. But thank you so much for being patient. By the way, the email address for that is questions@handsonapologetics.com. And that's all one word, questions@handsonapologetics.com. And that comes directly to the dojo. So, what is this finding the fallacy of loaded language / label? Well, basically, it's where people will sneak in under the radar certain terms that are packed with meaning, okay? And the meaning isn't describing something. It's actually trying to change color, persuade you to see things their way. So, like I said, it's a fallacy. It's also a propaganda technique. And this is something I use often. You know, whenever I get a quote from something, especially from the news, I just automatically pull out loaded language, because that shows me this person is trying to influence how I view the particular article. I just want the facts and nothing but the facts. So, for example, and this is a text I got off the internet. I think it's a good example of this loaded label, loaded language. And it's from a newspaper article. And it says this. The Supreme Court has just flinched in its responsibility to stop the unjust jailing of 2 journalists not charged with any wrongdoing by a runaway prosecutor who will go to any lengths to use the government's contempt power to force them to betray their confidential sources. So, okay, so notice the loaded language in here. The Supreme Court has just flinched. Okay, so why are they describing as flinching? You know, it kind of sneaks in under the radar that the Supreme Court's being reactionary, not thoughtful, not deliberate. You know, also responsible to stop the unjust jailing of the 2 journalists. Now, notice that the author couches it as an unjust action. Now, why not just present the facts of the case and let the reader decide whether it's just or unjust? Well, you know, that loaded language kind of already made that decision for you. And then he describes the prosecutor as by a runaway prosecutor. In other words, the prosecutor is going really beyond what's the norm for proper activity by a prosecutor. Finally, you know, and he'll go to any lengths. Now, this is the author's perspective. You know, according to his view, they'll go to any lengths. But really, I mean, how could you possibly prove something like that? And then finally, you know, that the government's contempt power to force them to betray their sources. Again, you know, it depends on the court case. Are they really going to betray their sources? Or is this something that really ought to be known? You know, all those judgments, all those things are worked into the text, and essentially it's presented to you as something that's already prejudged and prefabricated. And just by reading that without pulling out the loaded language or the loaded labels, you could be persuaded by, you know, taking a particular position that really maybe the facts of the case don't merit. So that is our finding the fallacy for today, the loaded language fallacy, also the loaded label fallacy. All right, so why don't we jump to meet the early church fathers? And like I said, today, I personally, I'm not familiar with this particular saint, but maybe you are. It's Saint Germain I of Constantinople. He was born sometime around AD 634, died around AD 733. His name is either Germain or German. It's spelled both ways. And he's the first of that name to be Patriarch of Constantinople. He was born there about the year, like I said, 634 AD. His father was a nobleman named Justinian, and was a confidant of the Emperor Heraclius, who reigned from 610 to 641. Justinian lost favor, however, with later emperors, and until 668 he was charged with treasonable conspiracy and executed. Germain, however, was castrated and obliged to join the clergy at the Church of the Hagia Sophia. There his fortunes and influence increased, which is kind of interesting. You would think that would be the end of the story for Germain, but no. His influence actually increases, and he's able to persuade the Emperor Constantine IV to convoke a third council, the Sixth Ecumenical Council of Constantinople, to condemn monothelism in 681. Now, what is monothelism? Well, it's the heresy that proposed that Jesus only had one will. Okay. And that was a divine will. So Jesus didn't have a human will. His human will was kind of hijacked by the divine nature. So it wasn't really in existence, or it was just a puppet. And of course, the Orthodox and the correct understanding is that Christ has two natures, divine and human. And, with the divine nature, of course, he has a divine will. But it's part of human nature to also have a human will. So Christ has two wills, divine and human. And, of course, since Christ never sinned, both of those wills always acted in concert with one another. Now, around the year 706, Germain was made Archbishop of, I'm going to butcher this name, it's Cyprus, I think it is. Cyprus. Accusations were made that under pressure from the emperor, and while still an ordinary of that see in 712 at a synod at Constantinople, Germain was weak enough to subscribe to the Monothelites, against which he earlier fought so well. And if that's true, and we're not really sure whether it is, he afterwards quickly reasserted faith in Christ of two wills and two natures. And in August 715, he was made Patriarch of Constantinople by the Orthodox Emperor Anastasius II. Germain immediately convoked a synod of Constantinople in 715 and issued a formal condemnation of monothelism. And by the way, Germain was also an ardent opponent of iconoclasm, and that is this heresy that you shouldn't use sacred images for religious worship or devotion. He was against that. He loved images. And on that account, he was deposed in already a man in his 90s by the Emperor Leo III, who was influenced by the Muslims. He eventually retired and died in 733 AD at the age of 98. And that is our early church father for today, St. Germain I of Constantinople. Coming up on the other side of the break, Karl Keating is coming into the dojo. We're going to talk about apologetics English way. Stay tuned.
Welcome to our January 11th, 2020 Spiritual Warfare Conference. Every year without fail, this is our most popular, well-attended event. This year's Spiritual Warfare Conference will host Adam Bly, a Catholic demonologist, and an auxiliary member of the International Association of Exorcists, along with Dr. Luis Sandoval, a psychiatrist who's part of the Healing, Deliverance, and Exorcism team for the Diocese of Orange. These two gentlemen bring tons of experience and expertise in the area of spiritual warfare. This is going to be a high-information Catholic seminar. I'll be there as well, sharing some riveting stories on the diabolical and liberation found through Jesus Christ from my best-selling book, The Devil in the City of Angels. Mark your calendars, come and join us, and meet other radio hosts from Jesus 911. Contrary to popular belief, spiritual warfare is not demon-centered, it's Christ-centered. Come join us and learn how to armor up and fight the good fight of faith. Catholics, wake up. Don't hit the snooze button. Join us at St. Christopher Catholic Church, 629 South Glendora Avenue, West Covina, California, on January 11, 2020. See you then. Strength and honor in Jesus' name.
Jesus said in Matthew 26, "Stay awake and pray that you may not enter into temptation." According to St. Ephrem, Jesus, who feared nothing, experienced fear and asked to be freed from death, although he knew it was impossible. How much more must we persevere in prayer before temptation assails us, so that we may be freed when the test has come? May God grant that we may withstand temptation and carry out His will in all things.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. Well, there are so many apologetic treasures that have been written in the past few decades. And there was a time where there was an explosion of incredible literary skill in England in regards to apologetics. And many of these classics, unfortunately, I think have kind of fallen by the wayside. And we need to know. We need to read because they're very enriching. And you learn a lot by reading these apologetic writers. And that brings up a treasure of the church, who is Karl Keating. Karl Keating did us a great favor by writing a book that kind of gives us a tour of apologetics the English way. Karl is the founder of Catholic Answers, and nowadays he's a full-time author. He's written so far 16 books on things like Catholicism, Fundamentalism, Debating Catholicism series, Book for Life, No Apology. He also writes on other genres besides apologetics, such as religion, literature, outdoors, self-publishing, and also possibly fiction. It says in the soon fiction. And Karl Keating, welcome to Hands on Apologetics.
Gary, it's great to be back with you.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to have you on. I have a question for you. I know what a polymath is, but is there a word for someone who writes in multiple genres?
I think it's public nuisance.
I didn't think about that term.
Well, that's probably more accurate than polymath, right?
Yeah.
To be honest.
Yeah, boy, it astounds me at the breadth of your writing abilities. I mean, it's one thing to do apologetics, which can sometimes be a little pedantic, but, to do some great books like on hiking and things like that, that's really cool.
Well, I have various interests. I think most people do.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm sufficiently full of myself that I figure, well, maybe someone else will be interested in my other interests beyond apologetics. So I write about them, and we'll see.
Yeah. And they look like great books, and especially, the one that we're going to talk about today is Apologetics the English Way. And in my introduction, I kind of noted that there was an explosion of English apologetics literature, in the early part of the turn of the last century. Such greats as Frank Sheed, Arnold Lund. You could go on and on. Any idea why at that particular time in England, there would be this kind of literary explosion?
Well, I think part of it was an historical happenstance, in that Catholicism had become legally legitimized late in the 19th century. The monarch, of course, still then and still now couldn't be a Catholic, but otherwise Catholics were able to go to Oxford and Cambridge and so on and so forth, So they were able to have a full place in English society. And then, especially after World War I, when so many people coming back from the war or having suffered at home from the war really didn't know what to think anymore about their society and their culture, because everything seemed to have collapsed, even among the Allied victorious powers. Still, things just fell apart, or so it seemed. So there was a real opening toward spirituality and things religious. And the Catholic Church, of course, had always offered a very rational approach to Christianity. There's the effective element, of course, but for those who are asking questions now that demanded an answer beyond mere sentimentalism, the Catholic Church had something to offer, and it was almost exciting, new, novel. And so you find in the 20s and 30s, particularly of the last century, a real blossoming of apologetical writing, especially in England. In the U.S. also, of course, but especially over there. And I think so that's why we see in the early 20th century quite a few excellent English writers coming up and developing their arguments, and not a few of them were converts, and so they were able to bring to their discussions a history of being on the other side, so to speak. So it was a volatile time intellectually. There was a social, publicly felt need for something deeper in the human person to respond to the tragedy of what the war had done, not just physically what the war had done, but sort of to the psyche even of the populace. And so I think those things together produce this efflorescence of fine British apologetics.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And you're right. A lot of them were converts to the Catholic faith, and in some ways, some of them were quite pugnacious. I mean, they were ready to go to battle, and they weren't afraid to enter into debate with people of their former denomination. Right? I mean, they
not
especially
at all, or people of no denomination, because not a few of them had as their chief opponents not Protestants, but people who would style themselves as agnostics or even atheists after World War I, because a lot of people were giving up hope in the tradition of the West, the intellectual tradition of the West, and so they fell into those kinds of ideas. So a lot of the Catholic apologists were finding that their chief work was not so much defending the faith or explaining the faith vis-a-vis evangelicals or fundamentalists, but rather, again, towards those who might style themselves materialists.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and, another thing, too, and this is what Apologetics the English Way does, is it reintroduces a genre of writing that has disappeared, namely written debates, where two people would square off within a book, and present their case and have exchanged letters, which is incredibly fun to read, by the way. And that kind of has fallen off the radar screen. Why do you think that genre of writing is few and far between?
I think letter writing, and this predates the internet.
Yeah.
Letter writing fell into disuse largely. I mean, substantial letter writing, where not just you're passing stray family gossip or something, but you're corresponding with somebody at a deeper level. And I think that was largely a consequence of the school systems both here and in Britain sort of dumbing things down. I remember the late Joe Sobran, an American columnist, once remarked, "A century ago, they taught Latin and Greek in high school. Now they teach remedial English in college." Well, that's how it is today. But also, even when I was young, say, already the ability to write anything, including letters, was much less than it had been a generation and more earlier. So that's part of it. And then, of course, as we get closer to our own time, when we have such things as the internet, composing a natural letter, whether you then send it by email or by the postal service, it becomes a bit of a project for most people because they find it difficult to write more than a couple paragraphs. So many people have become used to a 140-character limit or what have you.
Yeah.
And so they're not able to engage in an extended thinking process on paper, let alone with somebody else. Yeah, so the most of the things that I have that I've excerpted in Apologetics the English Way, and I should point out, I'm really the editor of the book. I've collected what I consider to be the best apologetical writing of over a period of time, especially in that sort of first third or so of the 20th century. and I have a lot of my own commentary in between the pieces, but mainly the text is what these men wrote. And they were able to write to one another over sometimes a period of years, letters of substance and wit and humor and elegance and depth on both sides, both the Catholics and their opponents, and then collect these together and have a book published. And the books are just a delight to read. And you're going to, as a Catholic, you're going to disagree with one of the parties, but still, you come away from the book saying, I'd have loved to have sat down with this fellow, this opponent of the church, because he was making probably maybe as good an argument as you could make against the Catholic position on whatever the topic was, and you can respect that, and you can see his thinking process, and all the way through, both the Catholic writer and the non-Catholic opponent were operating at a high level of courtesy and gentlemanliness. And that's really a British kind of trait. I think we tend to think of the gentlemanly style of correspondence as something almost peculiar to the British over maybe a century and a half period, from the early 19th century into the middle of the last century at least. And when I read something like this, I go back to these books and read them, I sigh a bit and say how much of that level of courtesy between opponents is missing in today's arguments. Even when good folks are writing, even intelligent people, let alone people who are exchanging unsubstantiated opinions on the internet. So I find this kind of writing, it's old stuff, but it's refreshing, and therefore it seems so new.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. And, as you were talking, I remember a quote from Marl Lunn, who talked about meeting, I think it was CEM Joad on a tennis court. And he said, even though we hammered each other with the utmost violence in writing, we still were good chums, afterwards. And that speaks to the level of discourse that, although, it was the ideas that were the focus, not the personalities.
Yeah, CEM Joad was, at the time, an agnostic. Late in life, he became a Christian member of the Church of England, in no small part to his exchange with Lunn. And I have in this book some of Lunn's.
Yeah, we'll go into that. Yeah, we're chatting with Karl Keating about his book Apologetics: The English Way. Stay tuned, everybody. We'll be right back.
Welcome, Daniel. You're on the line. What's on your mind, brother?
Hi, I just wanted to share a testimony about Virgin Most Powerful Radio. I had a buddy at work who, he's a lukewarm Catholic guy, and I wanted him to start listening to the Terry and Jesse show, so I kept telling him to download the app, and he kept putting me off. So one day, I grabbed his phone and I downloaded the app for him. I went on vacation, and I kept telling him to listen to it. He was kind of put me off. I came back from vacation. He comes to my cubicle and he says to me, "Hey, man, I've been listening to Terry and Jesse's show, and it's great." And it's made a big impact in his life. The guy, he's going to weekly adoration a couple times a week. He goes to the Mass in the morning. Mm-hmm. He's an on-fire Catholic, and he promotes the Terry and Jesse show on the Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Wow. Daniel, what a testimony. And I want to encourage our listeners to get those cards by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org and do what Daniel's doing. Go out and spread the faith by inviting people to listen to Virgin Most Powerful. Daniel, thanks for your testimony, brother. God love you.
You're welcome.
This is Terry Barber. I want to invite you to take advantage of having your funeral or your loved one's funeral at the Sacred Heart Chapel in downtown Covina. It's a 115-year-old church, beautiful chapel, and all you got to do is call me at 661-972-7872, and I'll personally make the arrangements with your mortuary to have your funeral or your loved one's funeral here at Sacred Heart Chapel. You won't regret it. 661-972-7872. God love you.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Karl Keating on his book, Apologetics, The English Way. And, Karl, before we get into all the different literary battles that you have excerpt in your book, I was looking at the chat room during the break, and Michelle in the chat room actually brought up something that I encountered. Is although English apologetics has incredible material, there are some authors that you kind of get lost in the prose. At least I do, and it's hard for me to follow because I end up marveling at the beauty of their writing. I often forget what they're actually saying or arguing. Have you ever encountered that yourself?
I can't say that I have. Do you have any particular names you want to bring up in that respect?
Yeah, well, a little bit of Newman, but mostly with C.S. Lewis. Try to think.
Lewis, of course, wasn't a Catholic, but
yes.
Very much of what he argued on many points perfectly in congruence with the Catholic faith. I have to say, I feel somewhat the same in Lewis. My favorite Lewis book isn't one that anyone else ever mentions. It's rather The Discarded Image, which is a book about the medieval worldview and its effect on literature. So It's not actually a book about religion directly, but I always thought it was Lewis's best book.
Interesting.
But there are some writers, English writers, I didn't even name Chesterton among them, that I can take only in certain amount of doses,
yes.
And I can't just keep reading through and through. And then there are others that I could just read endlessly and never get tired of. So I think that's maybe it's not a matter of the difficulty of the writing. Lewis, for example, was not a difficult writer in terms of his diction and phraseology and so on. But for some reason, I find I can't go through much of him. And even the same is true of Chesterton, even a simpler writer in certain senses. Mm-hmm. But, he's a writer I take in small doses. It's much as I need to take candy in small doses. If I get too much, I get a sugar high. Yeah. And I'm sort of that way with Chesterton, too, as much as I like him. On the other hand, his great friend Belloc, I can read Hilaire Belloc just without end. Okay. Yeah. So I think it's, partly temperamental on my part, and that may be something similar with you when it comes to those writers that you have a little more difficulty persisting with. Mm-hmm. And that may be true for, most any reader. But on the whole, to my mind, I find English, that is British writing, to be, all things else being equal, more attractive to my eye and my ear than I do American writing on the same general topics.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's just that there was always a couple of people who, it was almost like too beautiful. that I lose concentration on the content and get caught up on it.
I find that with a lot of spiritual writing from certain centuries in certain countries. To me, it's too saccharine, and I find it difficult to go through it, even though the language is simple. But I find it difficult to work through. And, some people are that way, others like the saccharine, so. Yeah. So we all have our preferences in what we want to read. But for for those who have not had a chance to read much in British Catholic apologetics, that's an area I would recommend them to get into. You'll find that the excerpts that I have in my book, Apologetics the English Way, are a more formal style, often of English, but often you read these, and these are just two, at any one point, two very intelligent men going back and forth in an almost normal conversational tone.
Yeah.
But it's not academic in that sense, not stuffy. But their erudition is so extensive that it can almost take our breath away, because we're not trained the same way. We don't have the background, and and again, one of the things that strikes me in these writings, certainly from the Catholic side, is a deep courtesy that the writer shows toward his opponents, even when he's at his toughest in saying, basically, you're completely wrong on that point. You're off the ball.
Yeah.
Even then, there's a great level of courtesy, which is a delight to see in an era like ours, where courtesy is not usually at the forefront of controversial writing.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And you did a great job. I mean, you gave 8 excerpts from some really heavy-hitting debates. Why don't we start with the first one, since he's most recently made a saint, St. John Henry Newman versus Charles Kingsley.
John Henry Newman, yeah. Back at the time, he was Father Newman when he engaged in an exchange with a then popular Victorian novelist named Charles Kingsley. Kingsley had some anti-Catholic prejudices, and he let them out quite imprudently at one point by saying basically that the Catholic Church teaches that it's okay to lie, particularly for priests, to further the efforts of the Church. And Kingsley's big mistake when he said that, if that's all he had said, it would have been passed largely unnoticed. But the big mistake was that he named Newman as an example of that. And he said that Father Newman, who had a bit of a reputation at that time, was an example of this thing. Well, Newman couldn't let that pass. So he started an exchange with Kingsley, and and went from there. And it's a remarkable thing. Now, the part that I excerpt here is actually an introductory piece to Newman's writing that doesn't appear in later editions of his work. I think he dropped it in second and later editions because it was a little too time specific. This is his Apologia Pro Vita Sua, which translates as basically an explanation for my life. And it's not. It's probably Newman's most famous work, but it's not an autobiography. He calls it an explanation of his religious opinions and how they changed over time. But he felt called to defend himself and his honor, so to speak, with Kingsley's challenge. And he probably wouldn't have written the book if Kingsley hadn't, written intemperately and named Newman.
Yeah.
So here's one of those situations where a peccadillo on somebody's side produces a wonderful piece of literature on the other side. And because Newman was actually a fairly retiring man. I mean, he didn't go out and look for a fight.
Right.
But he was going to defend the Church and his own good name, and he did in a wonderful way. So anyway, I give, as a first piece in Apologetics the English Way, I give material from Newman. Now, he's the only 19th century writer I've got in here. All the rest are 20th century writers, and all of their materials are from basically most of them 1930s, with one piece in the 1940s. Newman's in the 1860s here. So you've got a bit of a stretch. But I couldn't very well put a book together like this without including Newman.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
he was the chief British convert of the 19th century, and certainly one of the top scholars in England in that century. So anyway, he leads off the book, and then we get into a number of other folks.
Yep. Yeah. In fact, you have two Hilaire Belloc debates, one with J.B.S. Haldane and W.R. Ing. Now, we're probably all familiar with Hilaire Belloc's historical works, but I think most people wouldn't think of him as a debater.
But he really was a debater. He was a real scamp in many ways. He ran for Parliament at one point, and early on, he wrote. You mentioned it's the intro to the show that I write in several genres. Belloc wrote in many more. He wrote military histories. He wrote biographies. He wrote travel stories. The Path to Rome, his most famous book, is a pilgrimage on foot. He wrote all kinds of things. He wrote zillions of things for newspapers, that simply never got collected as books. But he had quite a few controversies with anti-Catholics. And one of them was J.B.S. Haldane, who was a well-known scientist at the time. Haldane appears later in this book because Arnold Lunn also had an exchange with Haldane. And but earlier on, Belloc has an exchange with him, and also with Dean Inge. Inge is always known as Dean. He was an Anglican clergyman, and known as a good scholar, but also pretty anti-Catholic. So Belloc here he was a man with, shall we say, an attitude. And you either like him or you don't, I think.
Yeah.
And again, he can sort of, some people think he's sort of wrote as though he's full of himself. And sometimes I suppose that's true. But he had a lot of wit, a lot of humor. Many of his books included little snippets of poetry that he would write, which were to be sung. They were actually songs. So although that kind of stuff doesn't appear here, his plain spokenness is one thing that comes through here in the two selections that I have. And they're not long. I mean, the one with Dean Inge is only 8 pages, and 22 pages for the one with Haldane. So they're not long excerpts from Belloc's side on these exchanges. And yet they do, give, I think, a flavor of the man. So, Belloc ended up writing more than 100 books, and again, in all sorts of genres. And if he's somebody that even today's Catholics ought to get to know.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we're chatting with Karl Keating about his book, Apologetics the English Way. Stay tuned. We're going to talk about more literary battles after this.
This is Jesse Romero.
And I'm Terry Barber
from the Terry and Jesse Show, and we invite you to listen to the Holy Hour of Power, high-energy Catholic radio. We're two Catholics with a PhD in common sense. We're on Monday through Friday on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
What we're going to give you is masculine Catholic teachings on the faith. We say we're too inspired to be tired, we're too protected to be dejected, and we're too renewed to be subdued. Why? Because we believe in Jesus Christ and His bride, the Church, and we will take each issue of the day and show you how the Catholic Church has the answer for our culture. What we really do is bring men back into the Catholic Church, which it's about time to do. We want men to be leaders in their Catholic faith so that they can bring their family to heaven.
Our program is not right versus left, it's right versus wrong, and our program is where Catholicism and culture intersect. It's high-energy Catholic radio.
We're going to inspire you to fall deeper in love with Jesus Christ and His bride, the Church.
The Terry and Jesse Show on the Virgin Most Powerful app.
Jesus said to the apostles in Luke chapter 10, "Whoever listens to you listens to me, and whoever rejects you rejects me." According to St. Boniface, in her voyage across the ocean of this world, the Church is like a great ship being pounded by the waves of life's different stresses. Our duty is not to abandon ship, but to keep her on course. May our Lord help us remain ever faithful to His church, to aid and defend her.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE, US 1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
Welcome back, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. We're talking with Karl Keating about his book, Apologetics, the English Way. And, Karl, I'm so grateful that you did this book because of the next person I want to bring up. This is a book that I've been trying for years to get a hold of a copy, but it's just so prohibitively expensive. It is the debate between Ronald Knox and Arnold Lund before his conversion to Catholicism.
Yeah, that's the book, Difficulties.
Yes.
I have to say it's my favorite book of apologetics, hands down. And it's a pity.
Oh, sure, rub it in.
Yeah, I didn't intend to do that, Gary. You got paid basically triple digits to get a copy of it.
Yeah.
I really wish a major publisher would just reprint the thing because it's a wonderfully done work. As you mentioned, this was done an exchange of letters in 1931 or so between Father Ronald Knox and Arnold Lund, who is not yet a Catholic, although he was a Christian. When he was young, he fell away from Christianity and became agnostic. But by this time, he was a Christian. In 1926, he'd written a book called Roman Converts, where he criticized people who converted to Rome. One of them was Knox. And he was a bit pushy in that book. Despite that, Knox agreed to have an exchange of correspondence, and they went at it. And the book came out in 1932, and a couple years later, Knox actually brought Lund into the church. So the exchange with Knox was not an insignificant part of Lund's own conversion process.
Yes. Yeah, very good. What part of the book do you think was a part where Knox really turned Arnold around? Is there any one point, that he hammers or that he makes that Lund?
No, I'd say that probably wasn't. The edition of the book that I have was actually from 1951, which is the second edition, where they each added one letter at the end of the book that originally was published, as I say, about 1932, I guess. And the original book, Lund ends by noting that the Protestant knight wasn't able to force the Catholic bishop into checkmate, so using the chess motif. But by the time the second edition came out with those two extra letters, Lund, of course, had been Catholic and a Catholic apologist for many years by that point. Yeah. But he admitted that one of the things that so impressed him was the persistence of Knox in being always able to give a solid answer, even if not at the time always a convincing answer to Lund's objection. So there was no one thing that switched Lund around. I would say it was a series of Lund repeatedly realizing he'd bring up his best objections. There's always at least an adequate response from Knox, and sometimes a convincing response from Knox. And the cumulative effect of that, then taken into mind over the next year or two, was substantial. So it wasn't as though Knox delivered a body blow, but more a whole lot of smaller positive impressions for the faith, to Lund. And the cumulative effect was enough to make a big difference in Lund's mind.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, and for Sir Arnold Lund, he was a debater, I think, by nature. He debated himself into atheism, then he debated himself into Christianity, then eventually he debated himself into Catholicism, then it was gloves off, and he debated everybody on the planet, it seems. And you have 3 such excerpts from Arnold Lund.
Yeah, one, like we just mentioned, where he's not yet a Catholic, and the next 2, he's a Catholic. Yeah. And those, again, are books from the 1930s where they were exchanges of letters. And the 3 books in which Lund was one of the correspondents, they basically overlapped with one another over a few years. The next book he was started with was with, again, J.B.S. Haldane, who earlier was written against by Hilaire Belloc. But Haldane was such a slow correspondent, it took him 9 months to get to a second letter, that Lund accepted a challenge from C.E.M. Joad, who was an agnostic philosopher, and they began an exchange of letters. So the book with Joad was called Is Christianity True? Mm-hmm. And the book with Haldane was called Science and the Supernatural. And then the exchange with Joad took only 8 months to finish. And then in that time, the exchange with Haldane was beginning to pick up steam. But the Haldane book didn't come out till, I think, 1935, and the Joad book before that. So Lund is writing, by the time he gets to the end of the book with Haldane in 1935, Lund's now a Catholic. But by the time, when he started the book, he wasn't. Yeah. So it's interesting that you see a bit of, in the book, of his own change of approach to some of the questions. But really, even from letter number 1, in these books against Haldane, the skeptic, really the materialist, and Joad, the agnostic, Lund is giving an argument that's perfectly Catholic all the way along regarding Christianity and its relation to reality and to science and so on. And so there's nothing in there that, if you didn't know, there's nothing in there that would make you suspect that when those correspondences started that Lund was not yet a Catholic.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. And you also have an excerpt of Lund versus G.G. Colton as well.
Yes, and that's right. That's the end. Now, G.G. Colton was an interesting, elderly, and very crabby Cambridge professor, and he styled himself an expert in the Middle Ages and in the Inquisition and so on. Very anti-Catholic. And so the last book that Lund had as an exchange of letters was with Colton. That was 1946, and it was a sour experience for Lund. The 2 men had agreed that the book be so many words long, which would have resulted in an X number of letters by each man if the letters were of a standard length. Well, Colton used up the large majority of his total word count in his first letter, which made it very difficult to continue the book as a good readable project for the reader.
Yeah.
But Colton was also the object of an exchange with someone maybe our listeners have never heard of, and that's a Jesuit named Herbert Thurston. Mm-hmm. And Thurston was maybe the most brilliant Jesuit of his time. He was a polymath in the true sense of the word, but also a man of great particularness in getting the facts right. And it's his exchange with Colton where which has the most footnotes of any in the book. Okay, I mean, most of the footnotes are in this one exchange of about 40 pages. But Colton had said that an American historian whom he sort of looked at as a protege, he was praising this American historian. And Thurston said, but the man doesn't know what he's talking about. He's got mistakes all over the place. And, I could find a mistake in every page nearly. And so a challenge went out, which Colton accepted. And he would provide Thurston with, I think it was 15 pages or 12 pages, I forget now, of arbitrarily taken from the workings of this American writer, and challenge Thurston to find even one mistake. Well, he found more than one per page. And these are not typos. These are historical mistakes. I mean, basic facts that a true scholar should have gotten right. And at the end of it, Colton has to concede that, he put too much credence in this American protege of his. But that really reflected back at Colton himself, okay?
Yes.
Who was, because of his anti-Catholic bias, ended up not being the historian that he should have on certain topics. But I include the Thurston versus Colton episode in here because it's a wonderful example of how a true Catholic scholar can dig under what seem to be perfectly innocuous and rational claims and just tear them apart.
Yeah.
If you really know your stuff, you can really undermine your opponent who probably doesn't get half the facts actually right. Okay.
Yeah.
So the Thurston piece is in a way sort of dry, but when you read through it and you're seeing left and right that he's finding these bloopers in this American historian's writing, you sort of just smile and just imagine what Colton must have been feeling as he went through this and said to himself, "Oh no,"
I love the whole book. I love all the excerpts. But I have to admit, I didn't know who Thurston was before, but I found myself giggling through the whole essay because, like he said, he would take something that seemed pretty innocuous and just blow it up at how counterfactual it was.
Yeah, and a lot of anti-Catholic writing is that way because many anti-Catholics think a charge is sufficient and they don't bother to substantiate the charge.
Yeah.
And this has just been true historically. In our own time, a lifetime ago, or longer than that in Thurston's time, it's enough just to make a charge that seems reasonably accurate, so long as it's a blow against the Catholic Church and its history and its doctrines and so forth.
Yeah.
But so many people don't go to the trouble to work up their arguments against the Church the way they would if they were arguing against maybe some political theory or what have you. They just take it for granted that basically this has got to be true because after all, my opponent's Catholicism, so I know it's wrong.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
And if it sounds like it's a slap on the Church, it's probably true. And so in a way, a real scholar like Thurston can just tear these claims apart and really show up the other side for what it is.
Yeah. Well, Karl, it's been a pleasure. Boy, the hour has just flown. Where can people go to get information on your books?
Best place is Amazon. Just look up my name and all the books will come up. And this one is Apologetics the English Way.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me, Gary. It's been a delight.
Yep. Karl Keating, ladies and gentlemen, and that is Apologetics the English Way. Get it if you don't have it, because it is a rollicking read. I love it. Coming up next, we have Impact Catholic Talk with the Terry and Jesse Show. And tomorrow, by the way, I'm going to have a remarkable conversion story of a good friend of mine. You won't want to miss it. It's Father Ed Friedy. It's going to blow you away. It's one that has always blown me away every time I hear it. Anyway, I hope everybody has a great day, and God willing, we'll talk again tomorrow. Bye-bye, everybody.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold. for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.